At 4:47 a.m., on October 23, 1942, Corporal Henrik Voss crouched in a forward observation trench 300 meters from the Soviet defensive perimeter, scanning the frost-covered steppe as 23 German Panzer III tanks rumbled toward his position through the pre-dawn darkness, their exhaust creating ghostly plumes in the -8-degree air. His left hand rested on a crude wooden lever connected to a series of improvised marker flags that would illuminate under magnesium flares, a positioning system he'd built from scavenged signal equipment that his commanders had called a waste of engineering material. The nearest Soviet artillery battery sat 7 kilometers behind the line, too far to provide effective counter-battery fire against the approaching German armor. In approximately 11 minutes, the lead Panzer would cross the invisible boundary of the minefield. Voss had spent 3 weeks mapping with mathematical precision his superiors refused to acknowledge. This was the story of a cartographer who proved that the most dangerous weapon on a battlefield isn't always the one that explodes. Sometimes it's the one that knows exactly where the explosions are buried. The sound reached him first, not the engines, but the peculiar metallic rhythm of tank treads compressing frozen earth. Voss had heard it before, during the German advance through Rostov, when he'd been nothing more than a supply clerk watching panzers roll past his position like industrial locusts. He'd counted them then, noted their spacing, timed their intervals, habits of a mind that saw patterns in everything. Now those same tanks were coming for his position, and Henrik Voss, a 32-year-old former surveyor from Leningrad, who'd been conscripted into the Red Army with minimal combat training, was the only man who knew the precise location of every single anti-tank mine buried in the frozen ground between here and the main defensive line. The problem was that nobody believed his maps were accurate. Henrik Voss had never wanted to be a soldier. Before the war, he'd worked for the Leningrad Municipal Planning Office, spending his days measuring property boundaries and elevation grades with the methodical precision that made him excellent at his job and insufferable at parties. His wife used to joke that he measured the distance between their dinner plates. His supervisor at the planning office had written in his file, "Competent but obsessive. Recommend reassignment to projects requiring minimal human interaction." When conscription came in 1941, Voss had been assigned to an engineering battalion not because he had any explosive training, but because someone in military administration had seen surveyor on his papers and assumed it was close enough to combat engineer. It wasn't. His battalion commander, Major Konstantin Petrov, had made his opinion clear during their first meeting. "You're a civilian playing soldier, Voss. You measure buildings. We blow them up. There's a difference." Petrov wasn't cruel, just pragmatic. He had actual combat engineers, men who'd trained for years in mine warfare, demolitions, and field fortifications. Voss was assigned to supply logistics and camp maintenance. When the battalion received orders to establish a defensive perimeter outside Stalingrad and deploy their limited supply of anti-tank mines, Voss wasn't even invited to the planning sessions. The minefield went in over 3 days in early October. Voss watched from a distance as combat engineers buried approximately 200 TM-41 anti-tank mines across a 2-kilometer front. The layout was standard Soviet doctrine: staggered rows with irregular spacing to prevent German engineers from establishing predictable clearance patterns. The engineers marked some positions on tactical maps, but the process was rushed. German reconnaissance aircraft had been spotted in the area. Accuracy was secondary to speed. After the engineers finished, Voss approached Lieutenant Dmitry Sokolov, the battalion's chief demolitions officer, with a simple question: "Do you have precise coordinates for every mine?" Sokolov had laughed. "Precise? We buried them in roughly 3 rows across the approach route. The Germans won't know they're there until they drive over them. That's the point." "But our own forces," Voss pressed. "If we need to maneuver through that sector—" "Then we don't maneuver through that sector," Sokolov interrupted. "It's a defensive mine barrier, Corporal. We're not tap dancing through it." Voss had nodded and walked away, but the incomplete documentation bothered him. It wasn't just about friendly forces avoiding their own mines, though that was important. It was about density, coverage, gaps. A minefield without precise mapping was a gamble. You hoped the enemy drove through the mines, but you couldn't guarantee coverage of critical approach routes. Over the next week, while officially assigned to inventory supply crates, Voss began his own survey. He started by interviewing every engineer who'd helped bury mines, asking them to recall, as best they could, where they'd placed each one. Most couldn't remember with any specificity. They'd been working in teams, moving quickly, operating under combat stress. One engineer told him, "I buried maybe 15 mines somewhere on the left sector. That's all I can tell you." Voss then examined the terrain itself. He'd learned in his surveying career that humans create patterns unconsciously. When placing objects randomly, people tend to space them more regularly than true randomness would suggest. They avoid extreme terrain features large rocks, deep ruts, obvious soft ground, even when instructed to place objects anywhere. He walked the minefield perimeter with a measuring tape and a notebook, identifying terrain features: a cluster of 3 birch trees, an eroded wash channel, a boulder with a distinctive crack pattern. Then he triangulated from these fixed points, using the engineer's vague recollections to narrow down probable mine locations. The work took him 2 weeks. He measured angles with a compass he'd requisitioned from supplies. He counted paces, exactly counted, calibrating his stride length against known distances. He cross-referenced soil disturbance patterns, visible from certain angles in morning light. Gradually, he built a detailed map showing estimated locations for 187 mines out of approximately 200 deployed. When he presented his work to Major Petrov, the response was polite dismissal. "This is impressive cartography, Corporal," Petrov said, examining the hand-drawn map covered in precise notations. "But it's based on terrain analysis and second-hand recollections. You didn't watch the mines being buried. You're making educated guesses." "Surveying is educated guessing," Voss countered. "I'm confident in these positions within a 3-meter margin of error." 3 meters? Lieutenant Sokolov, sitting beside Petrov, shook his head. "These mines have a kill radius of about 8 meters against tank tracks. Your 3-meter margin means you could be wrong about which row a mine is in. That's tactically useless." "It's tactically better than having no map at all," Voss said. "We have a map," Sokolov replied. "It shows 3 rows across 2 kilometers. That tells us what we need to know. Don't drive through that area." Major Petrov had softened the rejection with something almost like kindness. "Voss, I appreciate your diligence. Keep this map for your personal records if it makes you feel better. But I can't redistribute it to other units or base tactical decisions on it. If I tell our tank crews we have precise mine locations, and you're wrong, people die driving through gaps that don't exist. I need certainty, and your map, however well constructed, is still speculation." Voss had filed the map in his personal kit and returned to supply duties, but he'd continued updating it, incorporating new information. When perimeter patrols reported changes in terrain, a shell crater that obliterated one sector, a new position that might have disturbed buried mines, he adjusted his notes. The map became something between a professional project and a private obsession. His squadmates found it amusing. Sergeant Yuri Volkov had nicknamed him the Mine Librarian. Others simply ignored him, focusing on more immediate concerns: dwindling rations, frozen equipment, rumors that German armor was massing for a major offensive. Those rumors proved accurate. By mid-October 1942, the strategic situation around Stalingrad had become a brutal arithmetic problem. German forces, stretched thin across a massive front, needed to secure their flanks while pushing into the city itself. Soviet forces, bloodied but not broken, needed to prevent breakthroughs that would allow German armor to encircle defensive positions. The sector where Voss's battalion held the line was designated by Soviet command as low priority, a polite way of saying they were expected to delay, not stop, any serious German assault. The terrain was relatively flat steppe with limited natural defensive features. Soviet forces had dug trenches and established a thin perimeter, but everyone understood that if the Germans committed heavy armor, the line would fold. Intelligence reports indicated that elements of the 14th Panzer Division were operating in the vicinity. This wasn't the elite armor that was tearing through Stalingrad's factories. These were supporting units, slightly older Panzer III tanks with 50mm guns, backed by infantry. Still dangerous, but theoretically manageable if Soviet defenses held. The real problem was anti-tank capability. Voss's battalion had limited dedicated anti-tank weapons, 4 45mm anti-tank guns, a handful of PTRD-41 anti-tank rifles, and the minefield. That was essentially their entire armor defense strategy. Colonel Anatoly Kravchenko, the regimental commander responsible for their sector, had visited Major Petrov's headquarters on October 18th. Voss had been present, organizing supply manifests in the corner of the command bunker. He'd overheard their entire conversation. "Konstantin," Kravchenko had said, spreading maps across the rough wooden table. "German reconnaissance has been probing our sector for 3 days. They're looking for weak points." "We're reinforcing positions," Petrov replied. "Limited ammunition, but morale is stable." "Morale won't stop panzers." Kravchenko tapped the map. "Your minefield, how confident are you in its coverage?" Petrov had hesitated. "It's standard deployment. Multiple rows, irregular spacing. If they drive straight at us, they'll hit mines." "If," Kravchenko's voice had sharpened. "The entire defensive strategy for this sector assumes that minefield channels their armor into killing zones for our anti-tank guns. If there are gaps—" "There might be gaps," Petrov admitted. "We deployed quickly. We didn't have time for precision placement. Then we're gambling." "We're always gambling, Comrade Colonel." Kravchenko had studied the map for a long moment. "Do we have any better intelligence on mine positions? Anything that would let us predict German approach routes more accurately?" From his corner, Voss had looked up from his paperwork. This was the moment. He could mention his map, but Petrov was already shaking his head. "Nothing actionable," the major said. "We know the general minefield boundaries. That's sufficient for defensive planning." Voss had said nothing. Later, he'd wondered if speaking up might have changed what happened. Probably not. Kravchenko and Petrov were operating in a world of official documentation and verified intelligence. A surveyor's hand-drawn map based on terrain analysis didn't fit their framework. Voss understood. He'd worked in bureaucracy long enough to know that unconventional information, however accurate, rarely penetrated institutional thinking. The attack came 5 days later. The first indication was a low rumble that Voss initially mistook for distant thunder. Then he remembered. It was October in the Russian steppe. There were no thunderstorms at -8°C. He was in the forward observation trench, a shallow excavation about 300 meters in front of the main Soviet line. Officially, he wasn't supposed to be there. Forward positions were for combat observers and scouts, not supply logistics corporals. But Voss had volunteered for the pre-dawn watch, telling Sergeant Volkov he wanted to see the terrain at first light for better supply route planning. Volkov, perpetually short-handed, hadn't questioned it. The real reason was Voss's map. He'd brought it with him, wrapped in waterproof canvas. If the Germans attacked through this sector, he wanted to observe their approach route against his predicted minefield coverage. Pure intellectual curiosity, perhaps tinged with pride. He wanted to know if he'd been right. At 4:47 a.m., frost still coating every surface, Voss raised his binoculars and saw them. 23 tanks. He counted twice to be certain. Panzer IIs, moving in a loose formation across the open steppe, approaching from the northwest. Their spacing was approximately 70 to 80 meters between vehicles, standard German tactical doctrine to prevent multiple losses from single artillery strikes. Speed was modest, maybe 15 kilometers per hour, suggesting caution. They knew they were approaching Soviet positions but hadn't yet identified specific defensive emplacements. Behind the tanks, he could see infantry, perhaps 2 companies, moving in dispersed groups. They'd let the armor clear the approach, then follow through whatever breach the panzers created. Voss's hands were shaking. Not from fear, he'd process that later, but from the immediate mathematical problem crystallizing in his mind. The German formation was approaching at a 15-degree angle off perpendicular to the Soviet line. If they maintained that course, they would enter the minefield sector approximately 600 meters north of what Soviet doctrine considered the primary killing zone. He pulled out his map, hands fumbling with frozen fingers. The canvas crinkled as he unfolded it. He'd marked the minefield in red pencil. 187 individual circles, each representing an estimated mine position. The Soviet defensive plan, visible on official maps he'd studied in headquarters, assumed Germans would approach from due west, funneling into a narrow corridor covered by anti-tank guns. But these panzers were coming from the northwest, different angle entirely. Voss traced his finger across his map, following the German approach vector. His coverage estimates showed a gap, not a complete gap, but a zone of reduced density. The combat engineers, working quickly, had concentrated mines along the most obvious approach route. This secondary vector had thinner coverage, maybe 1/4 the mine density of the primary zone. How many mines would the German formation likely trigger? Voss did the math in his head, calculating intercept probabilities based on approach angle and mine spacing, assuming they maintained current formation. Statistically, maybe 4 to 6 mines. Out of 23 tanks, that meant 17 to 19 would break through the minefield intact and roll straight into Soviet trenches, defended by limited anti-tank guns and infantry with nothing heavier than rifles. The artillery battery 7 kilometers behind the line couldn't provide effective counter-battery fire without precise coordinates. Coordinates that would take precious minutes to calculate and transmit while German tanks crossed. The minefield. By the time shells landed, the panzers would already be among Soviet positions. There was a field telephone in the observation trench, a wire running back to battalion headquarters. Voss grabbed the receiver, cranked the handle. It rang 4 times before someone answered. Observation Post 3 reporting, Voss said, keeping his voice steady. 23 enemy tanks approaching from northwest vector, approximately 2,000 meters out. Request immediate fire support and alert anti-tank positions. Confirmed, came the reply. He recognized Private Mikhailov's voice. Alerting command now. Hold position and provide updates. The line went dead. Voss knew what was happening back at headquarters. Major Petrov would be pulling on his coat, studying tactical maps, calculating response options. The anti-tank gun crews would be readying their weapons, but they'd be aiming at the primary killing zone, not the secondary approach the Germans were actually using. Nobody except Voss knew there was a gap. He looked at his map again, then at the approaching tanks. In approximately 11 minutes, the lead panzer would enter the minefield. The mines that were buried there would either stop the German advance or fail to stop it. Either way, the outcome would validate or invalidate 3 weeks of meticulous surveying work that everyone had dismissed as pointless. Voss made a decision that would either mark him as a fool or a tactician. He grabbed the field telephone again and cranked it harder this time. When Mikhailov answered, Voss didn't wait for protocol. Put Major Petrov on. Immediately. Tell him Corporal Voss has critical tactical intelligence. It's about the minefield. Major Petrov came on the line 45 seconds later. Voss could hear the tension in his voice, background noise of men shouting, equipment moving. The entire defensive position was mobilizing. Voss. What intelligence? Make it quick. Sir, the German approach angle is wrong. They're coming from the northwest, not due west. Our mine concentration is wrong for that vector. I estimate they'll only hit approximately 4 to 6 mines before breakthrough. A pause. Then, how do you know this? I have detailed mine location data, the map I showed you 3 weeks ago. I can predict their route through the minefield with reasonable accuracy. Another pause. Longer this time. Voss could imagine Petrov's expression. The calculation between desperate need for any advantage and institutional skepticism of unconventional information. Voss, we're about to be hit by an armor assault. I don't have time for theoretical maps. Give me actionable intelligence, or get off this line. I can mark the gaps, sir. I can tell you exactly where to concentrate anti-tank fire to hit vehicles that make it through the minefield. If I'm wrong, you've wasted a few shells. If I'm right, you stop their breakthrough. The silence stretched. Voss pressed on. You said you needed certainty. I'm not offering certainty, but I'm offering better information than you currently have, which is none. The Germans are 10 minutes from the minefield. Sir, please. He heard Petrov's exhale, crackling through the telephone line. Sokolov is here. He says your map is speculation. It is speculation, Voss admitted. Educated, careful speculation based on terrain analysis and engineer interviews. But it's more accurate than assuming random mine distribution. Sir, use my data as a hypothesis. Test it. If the first German tanks hit mines where I predict, then trust the rest of my map. Another pause. Then Petrov's voice harder now. What do you need? Voss felt his chest tighten with something like hope. Permission to mark the predicted breakthrough zones with signal flares. When German tanks cross the minefield, we'll know immediately which ones avoided mines. Direct anti-tank fire there. You're asking me to base our defensive fire plan on your guesswork. I'm asking you to have a fire plan at all, sir. Without my map, you're aiming at where you hope they'll be. With my map, you're aiming at where I've calculated they'll probably be. Which would you prefer? He heard muffled conversation on the other end, Petrov conferring with someone, probably Sokolov. Then, you have 7 minutes before the lead tanks reach the minefield. Can you mark your predicted gaps in 7 minutes? Yes, sir. I have signal flares in this position. I need someone to relay my coordinates to the anti-tank guns. Lieutenant Sokolov will coordinate. Don't make me regret this, Voss. The line went dead. Voss dropped the receiver and grabbed his map, spreading it across the trench's frozen dirt floor. He had signal flares in his kit's standard observation post equipment, normally used to mark friendly positions or call for artillery. Now he'd use them to mark where German tanks wouldn't explode. He identified 3 zones on his map where mine density was low enough that advancing tanks had higher probability of breakthrough. Zone 1. Approximately 400 meters north of the primary defensive corridor, where engineers had rushed placement and left gaps of up to 50 meters between mines. Zone 2. A section where terrain features a slight ridgeline had caused engineers to unconsciously avoid certain areas. Zone 3. The southern edge of the minefield, where concentration tapered off. Based on the current German approach angle, they'd most likely exploit Zone 1. Voss climbed out of the trench, strictly forbidden during potential contact with the enemy, but he needed elevation to see the broader battlefield. The tanks were closer now, maybe 1,500 meters out, their forms visible as dark shapes against the lighter steppe. Their exhaust plumes caught the first hint of dawn light. He pulled a signal flare from his kit, aimed at a point approximately 420 meters downrange that corresponded to the northern edge of Zone 1 on his map, and fired. The flare arced into the pre-dawn darkness, bursting into brilliant magnesium light. It would burn for roughly 60 seconds, more than enough time for anti-tank gun crews to mark the position. He grabbed the field telephone again. When Mikhailov answered, Voss gave precise directions. Flare marking northern breakthrough zone. Anti-tank guns should prepare targeted fire 300 meters behind that position. Tanks that survive the minefield will appear there. Confirmed. Lieutenant Sokolov acknowledges. Voss fired 2 more flares, marking the center and southern edges of his predicted breakthrough zone. The flares hung in the air like artificial stars, burning against the darkness. On the German side, he saw the tank formation adjust slightly. They'd noticed the flares, but probably interpreted them as Soviet position markers. Good. Let them think the flares marked Soviet defensive positions, not their own likely approach route. The tanks kept coming. At 4:53 a.m., 6 minutes after Voss's initial sighting, the lead German Panzer entered the minefield. For 28 seconds, nothing happened. The Panzer III rolled forward at steady speed, its commander probably scanning for threats. Crew tensed for the sudden shock of anti-tank fire. The ground looked the same as the ground behind them. Frozen steppe, light frost, occasional patches of dead grass. Then the mine detonated. The explosion was a sharp crack rather than a deep boom, the distinctive signature of the TM-41's 3-kilogram TNT charge, punching upward into the tank's belly. The Panzer lurched violently, its left track shredding, the vehicle slewing sideways as its momentum carried it forward in an uncontrolled skid. It came to rest at an angle, immobilized. Smoke began pouring from the engine compartment. Voss watched through binoculars, his heart hammering. The mine had detonated approximately 12 meters from where he'd estimated one was buried. Well within his 3-meter margin of error, considering the tank had been moving when it struck the mine. The second Panzer, following roughly 100 meters behind the first, veered right standard German procedure, after contact with mines, to avoid following the same track. Smart doctrine, but it brought them directly toward another mine cluster Voss had mapped. 40 seconds later, the second explosion. This Panzer took the hit better. The mine detonated slightly off-center, damaging the right track but not completely immobilizing the vehicle. It ground to a halt, crew probably assessing damage, deciding whether to bail out or attempt repairs. The rest of the German formation stopped. Voss could imagine the radio chatter. Commanders reporting contact with mines, requesting guidance, debating whether to proceed or pull back for engineer support. Through his binoculars, he saw a third tank, one of the vehicles on the northern edge of the formation, begin moving again. It was advancing cautiously, commander probably trying to pick a route through what he assumed was a random minefield. Voss grabbed his map. That tank was approaching Zone 1, his predicted low-density sector. Based on the vehicle's current trajectory and his mine position estimates, it should pass through without hitting anything. He held his breath. The tank kept rolling, 100 meters, 200, 300 meters into the minefield without striking a mine. He grabbed the field telephone. Tank, approaching northern flare marker. No mine contact. Confirm anti-tank guns are tracking. Confirmed. Sokolov's voice came back. We see it. Holding fire until multiple targets present. Smart. Don't reveal anti-tank gun positions by firing at a single tank. Wait for the breakthrough, then hit them en masse. 2 more German tanks began following the lead vehicle's path. Then 3 more. They'd identified what they thought was a gap, which it was, exactly as Voss had predicted. His map was proving accurate in real time. Within 3 minutes, 7 German panzers had navigated through the low-density sector and emerged on the Soviet side of the minefield. They were approximately 600 meters from the main defensive line, reforming their attack formation. Behind them, the rest of the German armor sat at the minefield's edge. Some crews were dismounting, probably to probe for safe routes. Others remained buttoned up, waiting. Voss fired another signal flare, this one landing near where the breakthrough tanks were consolidating. Through the telephone, 7 tanks through the northern gap. They're at my flare position. Request anti-tank fire now. What happened next was the brutal algebra of anti-tank warfare. The Soviet 45mm anti-tank guns, pre-positioned based on Voss's predicted breakthrough zones, opened fire. The first shell struck a Panzer III in the turret side, penetrating the thinner armor and detonating inside the crew compartment. The tank lurched, then stopped, smoke pouring from every opening. The second gun engaged a different target, but the shell bounced off frontal armor, the 45mm gun's weakness against well-armored targets at range. The Panzer kept moving. The third gun fired, missed. The fourth gun's shell penetrated a tank's engine compartment, immobilizing it. The German tanks returned fire, their 50mm guns searching for Soviet positions. One shell landed near an anti-tank gun emplacement, showering the crew with frozen dirt but causing no casualties. The fight devolved into the grinding exchange typical of armored combat. Vehicles trading shells at mid-range, crews working with desperate efficiency to load, aim, fire. 3 more German tanks were hit in the next 2 minutes, 2 of them catastrophically. 1 Soviet anti-tank gun took a direct hit, killing 2 crew members and wounding a third. But the critical fact was this. The German breakthrough had been concentrated into exactly the zone Voss predicted. Soviet fire wasn't dispersed across a wide front, guessing where enemy armor might appear. It was concentrated, pre-aimed, waiting. The Germans had driven into a prepared killing zone because Voss's map had told Soviet gunners exactly where the minefield's weakness lay. By 5:08 a.m., 11 minutes after the first mine detonation, the German advance had stalled. Of the 7 tanks that broke through the minefield, 4 were destroyed, 2 were immobilized with damage, and 1 had retreated back toward the minefield's edge. The remaining German armor, still on the far side of the minefield, showed no signs of attempting another push. The field telephone rang. Voss grabbed it. Corporal Voss. It was Major Petrov, his voice carrying an emotion Voss couldn't quite identify. Your map was accurate. Extremely accurate. How many more predicted gaps do you have charted? 2 more potential breakthrough zones, sir, but both have higher mine density than the northern sector. If the Germans probe those areas, they'll take significantly higher casualties per vehicle. Can you predict their next move? Voss studied the battlefield through his binoculars. The German formation was reconsolidating, damaged tanks being recovered, infantry pulling back to defensive positions. They're withdrawing, sir. They committed approximately 1/3 of their armor to a probe assault. They've lost or disabled 6 vehicles with minimal territorial gain. Standard German doctrine would be to pull back, reassess, possibly call for artillery support or engineer units before attempting another advance. Your assessment? They won't attack this sector again today. Too costly. They'll probe elsewhere, or wait for better intelligence on our mine positions. Petrov was quiet for a moment. Then, return to headquarters. Bring your map. We need to discuss operational integration of your data. The line went dead. Voss sat in the frozen trench as dawn light slowly brightened the steppe. Around him, the sounds of battle were fading, a few scattered rifle shots, the distant rumble of retreating German vehicles. Smoke rose from burning tanks, both German and the single Soviet anti-tank gun that had been hit. His map, waterproof canvas now smudged with dirt and frost, lay beside him. 187 red circles, drawn with civilian precision, had just stopped a Panzer assault. Major Petrov's headquarters was organized chaos when Voss arrived at 6:15 a.m. Officers clustered around tactical maps, discussing fallback positions, ammunition status, casualty reports. Lieutenant Sokolov was arguing with someone about artillery coordination. The air smelled of tobacco smoke and the peculiar metallic anxiety of men who just survived combat. Petrov spotted Voss and gestured him over. "Show me the complete map. Everything you have." Voss spread his canvas across the command table, pushing aside other documents. Officers crowded around, studying his hand-drawn notations. "These circles are estimated mine positions?" Sokolov asked, his earlier skepticism notably absent. "Yes, based on terrain analysis, engineer interviews, and triangulation from fixed landmarks. The margin of error averages 3 meters, though some positions are more certain than others." Voss pointed to different sectors. "These mines marked in darker red are high-confidence positions. Lighter red indicates lower confidence." Colonel Kravchenko, who'd arrived from regimental headquarters during the battle, leaned over the map. "This is remarkable work, Corporal. How did you verify these positions without actually digging up mines?" "I didn't verify most of them, sir. It's extrapolation and probability mapping. But I verified methodology by cross-referencing engineer testimony with terrain features. Where 5 different engineers said somewhere in that area, I could narrow down likely placement based on where humans naturally place objects when working quickly." Petrov tapped the northern sector. "You identified this gap 3 weeks ago?" "Yes, sir." The mine density there is approximately 40% of the density in the primary defensive zone. I flagged it as a vulnerability in my original report. A report I dismissed. Petrov's voice carried no defensiveness, just statement of fact. You dismissed it because it was speculative intelligence, sir. That was reasonable. It was bureaucratic. Petrov looked at Kravchenko. We should have tested his data before we needed it. Now we're conducting validation under fire. Kravchenko studied the map more closely. This gives us significant operational advantage, but only if we can systematically verify these positions. Corporal Voss, can you work with our engineering officers to confirm your estimates? Yes, sir. I recommend selective probing, physically locating a sample of mines I've marked, then using those confirmations to validate my methodology. If my predictions are accurate for 20 mines, we can reasonably trust the remaining positions. Sokolov frowned. That's still risky. We're basing defensive planning on partially verified data. We're basing it on better data than we had yesterday, Petrov countered. Yesterday we had mines or somewhere in that general area. Today we have specific position estimates that proved accurate under combat conditions. He looked at Voss. What do you need to improve this map? Access to all available intelligence on mine placement. If there are any photographs, measurements, engineering logs that weren't included in official reports, anything that might confirm or refine my estimates. Also, I'd like to interview engineers again, now that they've had time to recall details. Done. Lieutenant Sokolov, you're now working directly with Corporal Voss. Give him whatever resources he needs. Petrov rolled up the canvas map carefully. This stays in headquarters. We're making copies for defensive planning. Voss, you're reassigned from supply logistics. Your new assignment is terrain and mine documentation. Consider yourself our resident cartographer. It wasn't a promotion in rank. Voss remained a corporal, but the change in function was significant. Over the next week, working with engineering officers who no longer dismissed his methods, he refined his map. Selective probing of mine positions confirmed his estimates at an 86% accuracy rate, far higher than the random chance that skeptics had assumed. Word spread through the battalion. Voss, the surveyor nobody had trusted, became the man who'd stopped a Panzer attack with a hand-drawn map. The nickname Mine Librarian took on a different connotation, respect rather than mockery. On October 30th, German forces attempted another probe of the sector, this time approaching from the southwest. Soviet commanders, now equipped with Voss's detailed minefield map, repositioned anti-tank guns to cover the two most likely breakthrough zones. The German attack struck one of these zones almost perfectly. Of 12 tanks that attempted the crossing, 8 were destroyed or disabled by mines, and the remaining 4 were engaged by concentrated anti-tank fire before they could exploit the breach. The assault collapsed within 20 minutes. Intelligence reports later confirmed that German commanders had flagged the sector as heavily mined with unknown defensive depth and shifted their operational focus to other areas. The minefield, once a gamble, had become a genuine barrier not because more mines had been added, but because Soviet defenders now knew exactly where the existing mines were, allowing them to turn minefield gaps into killing zones. By early November, Voss's reputation had spread beyond his immediate battalion. Other units operating defensive minefields began requesting his assistance. Could he survey their sectors? Could he train other soldiers in his methodology? The Soviet military bureaucracy, initially suspicious of unconventional intelligence methods, began formal documentation of what they termed probability-based mine mapping. Voss wrote a technical report, dry, methodical, filled with mathematical formulas for terrain analysis and triangulation. It was distributed to engineering battalions across the Stalingrad front. Some adopted his methods. Others remained skeptical. But the data was compelling. Units using detailed mine maps reported significantly higher enemy casualty rates when defending minefield sectors compared to units relying on general position estimates. For Voss personally, the work remained oddly unchanged. He still measured distances, triangulated positions, documented terrain features with obsessive precision. The difference was that now people listened. Lieutenant Sokolov, who'd initially dismissed the map as speculation, became one of Voss's strongest advocates. In a conversation over thin soup in the mess tent, he'd admitted, "I was wrong about you. Not because you were lucky, because you were rigorous. You treated mine placement like a scientific problem instead of a military assumption. That's rare thinking in combat." "I'm not a soldier," Voss had replied. "I'm a surveyor who happens to be in a war." "No," Sokolov corrected. "You're a soldier who found a way to fight with the skills you already had. That's more valuable than any amount of weapons training." The compliment had meant more to Voss than he'd expected. The true test of Voss's methodology came 2 weeks after the initial Panzer engagement. German forces, having studied Soviet defensive positions through aerial reconnaissance and captured maps, planned a coordinated assault on a different sector, one where Soviet mine deployment had been even more rushed and poorly documented than Voss's area. The sector was designated Defensive Position 12, held by the 214th Rifle Regiment. Intelligence reports indicated that approximately 150 anti-tank mines had been deployed there in early October, but no detailed maps existed. The regiment's commander, Captain Ilya Antonov, had requested any available mine documentation. Major Petrov sent Voss. "You have 48 hours, Petrov told him. "Survey that sector and produce the best map you can. German armor is expected to hit them within 3 days." Voss arrived at Position 12 on November 6th with his surveying equipment, notebooks, and the reputation that had preceded him. Captain Antonov greeted him skeptically. "I've heard about your methods, Corporal, measuring terrain features and interviewing soldiers. You understand that our engineers didn't keep detailed records. Most of them are dead or transferred. I can give you 2 witnesses who remember anything about mine placement." "2 witnesses are better than none, sir," Voss replied. The sector was broader than his own, nearly 3 kilometers of front. The terrain was slightly more complex. A gradual slope with several dry creek beds that created natural channels for vehicle movement. Voss walked the area methodically, noting every feature that might have influenced where engineers placed mines. The 2 engineers he interviewed, both privates who'd helped with deployment, provided vague but useful information. One recalled that they'd been ordered to concentrate mines near the Big Rocks, a cluster of granite boulders on the sector's northern edge. The other remembered placing mines along what they'd thought was a vehicle approach route, but couldn't remember exactly where that route was. Voss spent 2 days triangulating, measuring, analyzing terrain. He produced a map showing estimated positions for 97 mines. His confidence level was lower than his original map, maybe 60% accuracy rather than 80%, but it was substantially better than the complete absence of information that had existed before. Captain Antonov studied the map when Voss delivered it on the evening of November 7th. "You're telling me you've located 97 mines based on looking at rocks and creek beds? And engineering psychology, terrain probability analysis, and witness testimony," Voss added. "Sir, I'm not claiming this map is perfect. I'm claiming it's better than assuming random distribution. Show me your highest confidence predictions. Where are you most certain there are mines?" Voss pointed to 3 areas. "These clusters. The terrain features are strong enough that mine placement was almost inevitable. Engineers working under time pressure naturally use landmarks for positioning. And where are the gaps? Here, here, and here." Voss indicated 3 zones. Low confidence in mine density. If German armor comes through, these are their most likely breakthrough routes. Antonov made his decision. "We'll position anti-tank guns to cover your predicted gaps. If you're wrong, we're exposed. If you're right, we stop them cold." The German attack came at dawn on November 8th. 16 Panzer IIIs and approximately 400 infantry, hitting Position 12 in a concentrated assault aimed at breaking through to Soviet rear areas. The result was devastatingly effective. German tanks, attempting to advance through what appeared to be open ground, struck mines at a rate far higher than their commanders had anticipated. In the first 10 minutes of the attack, 7 tanks hit mines, 4 catastrophic kills, 3 mobility kills. The German formation fragmented, with vehicles attempting to find safe routes through what they now recognized as a denser-than-expected minefield. The tanks that did navigate through the minefield emerged almost exactly where Voss had predicted, concentrated into 2 narrow corridors that Soviet anti-tank guns had been pre-registered to cover. The engagement became a shooting gallery. German armor, channeled by the minefield into predictable approach routes, faced overlapping fields of fire from prepared positions. By 7:30 a.m., the assault had collapsed. German forces withdrew, leaving 12 destroyed or disabled tanks in the minefield. Soviet casualties: 3 wounded, no fatalities, no lost positions. Captain Antonov sent a message to Major Petrov that afternoon. Voss's map was accurate. Request permanent assignment to our sector. Petrov declined. Voss was needed elsewhere. Other sectors needed surveying. Other commanders needed training in his methods. Henrik Voss continued his surveying work through November and into December 1942. He mapped 7 additional minefield sectors, trained 11 other soldiers in terrain probability analysis, and wrote 3 technical reports that were distributed throughout Soviet defensive units in the Stalingrad theater. The cumulative effect was measurable. Sectors with detailed mine maps inflicted, on average, 43% higher enemy armor casualties per engagement than sectors with only general mine position estimates. More importantly, Soviet defenders in those sectors experienced lower casualty rates. They weren't guessing where threats would emerge. They were prepared for specific approach routes. But the work took its toll in ways Voss hadn't anticipated. On December 12th, while surveying a minefield near the Rosashka River, he witnessed a Soviet tank crew inadvertently drive into a minefield sector he'd marked as high density. The tank hit a mine, exploded, and killed 3 of the 4 crew members. The sole survivor, badly burned, had to be evacuated. The incident had occurred because of poor communication. The tank crew hadn't received updated mine maps or had received them but failed to consult them before moving. Either way, the result was the same. Voss felt responsible. His maps existed to prevent exactly this kind of friendly fire tragedy. But maps were only useful if people had access to them and understood them. The Soviet military bureaucracy, stretched thin by combat operations, struggled with consistent information distribution. He wrote a memo to Major Petrov recommending standardized procedures for mine map distribution. Petrov approved it, but implementation was uneven. Some units adopted the procedures immediately. Others, overwhelmed by more immediate concerns, filed the documents and forgot about them. Voss came to understand a hard truth. Precision was only valuable if systems existed to act on that precision. His maps were tools, but tools were worthless without proper use. The Battle of Stalingrad reached its culmination in late January 1943 with the encirclement and surrender of German forces. Voss's battalion, having held its sector throughout the siege, was reassigned to securing captured German positions and clearing minefields, both Soviet and German, to allow movement of supplies and reinforcements. Voss participated in the clearance operations, working with combat engineers to systematically remove mines based on his documented positions. The process was slow and dangerous, but his maps proved their value one final time. 91% of the mines he'd charted were found within 5 meters of his predicted positions. He also examined German mine maps captured from an engineering unit. The Germans, it turned out, had maintained meticulous records of their own minefields, precise coordinates, mine types, detonation mechanisms, all documented with bureaucratic thoroughness. Voss felt a strange kinship with the German engineers who'd created those maps. They'd understood what he understood, that chaos required documentation, that warfare produced entropy, and that the only defense against entropy was careful record-keeping. On January 28, 1943, Major Petrov called Voss to headquarters for what would be their final conversation before the battalion was disbanded and reassigned. "You're being transferred," Petrov said without preamble. "Red Army Engineering Command. They want you in Moscow, working on standardized mine documentation procedures for the entire front." Voss blinked. "Moscow? I'm not qualified for strategic-level planning. I'm a surveyor." "You're the surveyor who stopped 3 separate Panzer assaults with hand-drawn maps," Petrov replied. "Engineering Command, read your reports. They want to institutionalize your methods, train engineers in probability-based mapping, develop protocols for rapid field surveys, create standardized templates for mine documentation. This is bigger than one sector or one battalion. They're systematizing what you invented." "I didn't invent anything," Voss protested. "I just applied surveying principles to a military context." "That's exactly what invention is. Taking something from one context and applying it somewhere new." Petrov extended his hand. "You're leaving in 3 days. Transportation is arranged. Consider this a commendation, Corporal, even if they don't give you a medal." They shook hands. Voss wanted to say something meaningful, but the words wouldn't come. Finally, he managed. "Thank you for trusting my map, sir. That morning in October?" "I didn't trust your map," Petrov said honestly. "I trusted that you believed in it enough to stake your reputation on it. That level of conviction usually means something. In your case, it meant you were right." The Red Army Engineering Command headquarters in Moscow was a world removed from frozen trenches and minefield sectors. Voss found himself in a heated office building, working with military planners and academic mathematicians to formalize mine documentation procedures. His days became a strange echo of his pre-war life, drawing maps, writing technical specifications, attending meetings where men debated optimal grid sizes for mine position notation. It was bureaucracy in service of battlefield efficiency. Voss understood both sides of that equation well. The work was important. The procedures he helped develop would be used throughout the Red Army's continued advance westward. Thousands of soldiers would rely on improved mine documentation to navigate both friendly and enemy minefields more safely. But Voss found himself missing the immediacy of field survey work. In Moscow, he drew maps of places he'd never seen, based on reports from soldiers he'd never met. The precision was there, but the connection to actual earth, actual terrain that tanks would cross and men would fight across, felt abstract. He requested a transfer back to field operations in April 1943. His supervisors denied the request. "You're more valuable here, Corporal. The intellectual work you're doing will save more lives than surveying individual sectors." They were probably right. Voss continued his work in Moscow through the spring and summer of 1943, contributing to mine warfare doctrine that would shape Soviet defensive and offensive operations for the remainder of the war. But when he thought about his military service, the moments that had mattered, he always returned to that pre-dawn watch on October 23rd, 1942. Standing in a frozen trench with a hand-drawn map, watching Panzer EIs approach through the darkness, knowing that his observations and measurements would be tested against reality in a matter of minutes. That was the moment when precision had met consequence. When 3 weeks of surveying work had condensed into a single tactical decision that saved lives and stopped an assault. Everything else was commentary on that moment. Henrik Voss survived the war. He returned to Leningrad in 1945 to find his city devastated by siege but still standing. His wife had survived, working in a munitions factory. Their apartment building had been destroyed by artillery, but they found new housing through a municipal reconstruction program. He returned to work at the Leningrad Municipal Planning Office, resuming his pre-war career of measuring property boundaries and elevation grades. His supervisor, the same man who'd written recommend reassignment to projects requiring minimal human interaction, greeted him warmly and never mentioned the old assessment. Voss never spoke much about his military service. When colleagues asked what he'd done during the war, he'd answer simply, "Engineering support, mapping." The Red Army, for its part, quietly incorporated his mine documentation procedures into standard operating doctrine. The techniques he'd developed, terrain probability analysis, systematic triangulation from landmarks, standardized notation for confidence levels, became routine training for combat engineers. No single document credited him by name. Military procedures rarely acknowledged individual inventors. But soldiers who'd served with him remembered. Yuri Volkov, the sergeant who'd nicknamed him the Mine Librarian, wrote Voss a letter in 1947. It was short, mentioning a chance encounter with another veteran who'd served in a different sector but had heard stories about the corporal who mapped minefields by looking at rocks. Volkov's letter ended. "I told him the stories were true. I was there when you proved it." Lieutenant Sokolov, promoted to captain by war's end, visited Voss in Leningrad in 1950. They shared dinner in a small restaurant near the Neva River. Halfway through the meal, Sokolov said, "I've been thinking about that morning. October 23rd. Do you remember?" "Yes," Voss replied. "You made a prediction based on data nobody trusted, and then you were right. Not partially right, spectacularly right. Do you know how rare that is?" Voss considered the question. "Being right is easy if you're rigorous. The hard part is convincing people to act on your analysis before you can prove it's accurate." "That's not about rigor," Sokolov said. "That's about courage. You put your reputation on a hypothesis." "I put my reputation on measurements and probability," Voss corrected. The hypothesis was just the logical conclusion. They finished dinner. As they left the restaurant, Sokolov shook his hand and said, "You taught me something important during the war. Expertise isn't always about credentials. Sometimes it's about someone being willing to measure carefully while everyone else is guessing." Voss thought about that observation for years afterward. It seemed to summarize his entire military experience. He'd never been formally trained for combat engineering or mine warfare. He'd simply applied the skills he possessed to the problem in front of him, with meticulous attention to detail that others had mistaken for foolishness until it proved to be precision. In 1967, at age 57, Henrik Voss retired from the Leningrad Municipal Planning Office. His final project was surveying a new residential development in a district that had been heavily damaged during the siege. The work was routine, measuring lot boundaries, verifying elevation grades, ensuring compliance with building codes. On his last day, his supervisor asked if he wanted to take home any keepsakes, old maps, surveying equipment, documents from his career. Voss declined most of it, but he did keep one item, a worn canvas-wrapped package that had sat in his desk drawer for 25 years. At home, he unwrapped it carefully. The canvas was still waterproof, though discolored with age. Inside was his original minefield map, 187 red circles drawn in pencil, notations about terrain features, confidence level indicators, dated October 1942. He'd carried it through the rest of the war, then brought it home, unable to discard something that had meant so much at a specific moment. Now, looking at it in his retirement, he saw it differently. The map wasn't remarkable for its accuracy, though that accuracy had proven life-saving. It was remarkable because it represented a simple idea, that careful observation could matter more than official doctrine, that precision could triumph over assumption, that a methodical civilian forced into military service could find a way to fight using the only weapons he possessed: measurement and calculation. Voss framed the map and hung it in his study. When grandchildren visited and asked what it was, he'd explain, "It's a map I made during the war. It shows where certain things were buried." "What things?" "Mines. Anti-tank mines." "Did it work? Did the map help?" "Yes," Voss would answer simply. "It worked." He never elaborated beyond that. The story wasn't about glory or heroism concepts that made him uncomfortable. It was about doing the work, being rigorous, measuring carefully even when others dismissed the effort. Henrik Voss died in 1979 at age 69, quietly, in his sleep. The framed map hung in his study until his family donated it to the Leningrad Military History Museum in 1982, where it remains in their archive, a hand-drawn artifact from a war full of much more dramatic relics. But for those who know its history, the map represents something significant. Proof that expertise can come from unexpected sources, that unconventional thinking can solve conventional problems, and that sometimes the most dangerous weapon on a battlefield isn't the one that explodes loudest, but the one that knows exactly where everything else is buried.